Hello there, I'm Ameera David. This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today. Cable TV is beginning to lose its signal on Wall Street, and media companies are starting to feel the heat. Is the pay TV bundle starting to fall apart? I've got the latest details just ahead. Then Jennifer Granick is on the show. She's the keynote speaker at this year's Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas, and we sat down for a one-on-one conversation with her, so you don't want to miss that. And in today's big deal, Manuel Rapalo and I are talking about U.S. remittances. We're seeing an uptick in funds being sent home by migrant workers from the U.S. So what kind of impact is that having on GDP in the developing world? We'll answer that and so much more on today's show. Don't go anywhere. Boom Bust starts right now. Well, the cracks in the traditional TV bundling model have just gotten deeper. On Wednesday of this week, media companies and distributors indicated that more people were cutting the cord and ditching expensive TV cable packages altogether. And as a result, media stocks are starting to tumble. I want you to take a look at this right here. These are some of the major media companies and how much their shares declined this week. Analysts say much of this was sparked by Walt Disney. As you can see, shares at Disney tumbled 9.2% on Wednesday. Now, that's just a day after the company reported it would be trimming its forecast for TV subscriber fee profit growth. That's something they say has been a direct result of losses from their flagship network, ESPN. Disney CEO Bob Iger has spent a lot of time defending ESPN's overall health to investors. However, he did admit this week that households were simply switching to smaller cable packages that don't include the high-priced sports network. And the news has begun stoking fears that more consumers are turning away from traditional paid TV services, possibly hurting the industry's biggest players in the long term. Analysts say the Disney admission in and of itself spooked investors enough to see sell-offs across the entire entertainment industry. And you're seeing that from Time Warner, which closed down 9%, Viacom at 7.5%, and even CBS at 4.6%. On the other hand, if you look at how on-demand video companies like Netflix are doing, well, those paint a far different story. Netflix, for example, was up 2% on Wednesday and on Thursday, and that further cements the contrast between traditional TV models and the alternative ones that will continue to challenge them in the future. To talk about the internet and privacy, Jennifer Granick is on the show. Jennifer is the director of civil liberties at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. She was also the keynote speaker at this year's Black Hat Conference, and in her address, she talked about how she thought the internet would, quote, leave behind the shackles of age, of race, of gender, of class, even of law. But 20 years on, cyberspace looks a lot less revolutionary than it once did. So Boom Bust correspondent Bianca Facchinei got a chance to speak with Jennifer at the conference and asked her how we got the internet so wrong. Here's what she had to say.
So, the idea is that technology would be liberating in all these ways, and, primarily that the internet was going to make it possible for us to have access to all this information without corporate shaping or government censorship, and that we would, this would bring us all together in a way that was transcendent from race and class and gender and age. But that turned out not to be true. And some of that, I think, is that old habits die hard. People have these entrenched ways of being, and it turns out that racism and sexism are strong enough and resilient enough to thrive even in the technology world and, and even online. In terms of the access to information, the internet was built in this decentralized way. And the idea was that, people could decide what they wanted to do. The pipes that carried the traffic wouldn't decide. But what's ended up happening is that we've seen this real centralization for a variety of reasons, from economic, like business models, to people wanting better services and them the services being able to be more effectively provided through centralization. So we have the whole issue of platforms like Facebook, or or monopoly even, where one company owns most of the fiber optic cables. And what happens when you have that centralization is that it's a choke point, and that choke point is a focus for government regulation.
In April of this year, you co-wrote a letter to lawmakers in opposition to 3 bills proposed in Congress: the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, the Protecting Cyber Networks Act, and the National Cybersecurity Protection Advancement Act of 2015. So what specifically was wrong with the bill proposals?
So the letter from April was regarding information sharing bills. And the idea behind information sharing is a good one, which is that when people know what vulnerabilities are out there, they can then patch their networks and look to see if they've been attacked by anyone using those vulnerabilities. So the idea is a good one. But every one of those bills has a critical flaw. Or 2 critical flaws. And the flaw is that they broadly define information that can be shared to include very private data, and then they waive privacy law. And they say companies will have immunity if they violate privacy law in sharing this data. So basically, these bills are end runs around the very weak and sketchy privacy rules that we already have in place. And not for any good reason, because the kind of information that we need to share in order for people to know what the vulnerabilities are and make their network safer generally doesn't include private information that's protected by statute. So the whole fundamental structure of these laws is wrong. And in the letter, technologists were trying to explain to lawmakers that the kind of data they need isn't the kind of data that's private. So instead of saying, don't worry about protecting private data, say, share this information.
An investigation published in The Intercept demonstrated that the Department of Homeland Security monitored the Black Lives Movement, and they were also watching a funk music parade and a breast cancer walk. So, this is pretty crazy to me. What kind of impact do you think that this type of surveillance has on social movements in our country?
The problem with surveillance is twofold. One is it scares people. And so people then are afraid to participate in political movements or to express their opinion or even to read online, because they're afraid that they're going to be spied on and then have that information used against them. So it has this chilling effect. But the second problem is that it really upends the balance of power between individuals and the government, because when the government knows everything about you, they can do anything. Everybody has secrets that they want to keep, and when you know everything about somebody, you can figure out exactly the way to bring someone down, even if they haven't already done something wrong. So it gives the government this huge amount of power, and that also is dangerous to political movements, which are inherently about trying to change the balance of power and make government and our society better. So it is a really serious problem. But it's a problem that we should know better about. We've had for years reports on the Department of Homeland Security and fusion centers and the kinds of things that they're spying on. And we regularly spy on what I think everybody would agree is the wrong people. And we spied on Occupy, we spied on the breast cancer march, now we're spying on Black Lives Matter. This is not, we've got better things to do.
Do you think we'll ever see right to be forgotten laws in the U.S., and why or why not?
We will never see right to be forgotten in the United States. The right to be forgotten is an abomination under U.S. law. It's basically removing truthful information that's already been published from the public internet, and the First Amendment would not allow that. I think it's substantively a fiasco, because the idea that we're going to censor truthful information, to me, is just wrong. The information was published for a reason. It is part of the historical record, and I think that there's something really disturbing about trying to hide facts and edit the historical record. So that, I think, is just bothersome. I think it's a fiasco in implementation because the standards are so loosey-goosey. The court that found that the European Union has this right, talked about whether things are irrelevant. And irrelevant isn't really a good legal standard. It's very complicated to figure out what's irrelevant and then to balance relevance with the public interest, which is also an amorphous standard. But rather than do the hard work that a court should do, a democratically responsive court should do, and figure out exactly what the parameters of this new right are and when it should be respected and when it shouldn't, the court just basically punted the whole issue to a private entity, Google, and tried to say, okay, Google, well, we don't really know, but you decide, you figure out the cases.
Final question. Do you think as society advances with technology that we'll continue to see this battle between privacy and security?
I don't believe in the war between privacy and security. I think privacy can protect security. For example, if you have privacy is important for journalists and human rights workers. Without it, they can be targeted and attacked. So they need privacy for security. And I don't think that we need to trade off privacy to get security. Locking cockpit doors is an example of a security measure that helps us without trading off privacy. So I don't think there's a zero-sum game there or like a seesaw. We have choices there. But there's no question that modern technology means a lot of information collecting, and that is a problem. It's a problem in terms of whether we will be manipulated by companies who know everything about us and whether we will be targeted for prosecution or surveillance or underhanded tricks by governments that know this stuff about us as well.
Time now for a quick break, but stick around because when we return, we'll talk about the new rule that mandates companies to report their CEO to worker pay ratio, thereby putting a spotlight on income inequality. Then in today's big deal, Manuel Rapalo and I are talking about U.S. remittances and actually global remittances. We're seeing an uptick in funds being sent home by migrant workers all over the world. So what is that doing for economies at home? We'll tell you coming right up, so stay with us. And as we go to break, here are the closing numbers at the bell. Welcome back to the show. Drones have certainly evolved over the years, now used in so many different capacities. But that could expand even further when another feature is added, the ability to hack personal computers. Aerospace manufacturer Boeing and a hacking team group are reportedly talking about doing just that. And RT correspondent Alexei Yarashevsky has the details.
Ever since they appeared on the market, drones have been a game changer for many industries. They can be used to film movies, monitor how farmers work in the field, and even drop bombs. From now on, it seems they can be also used to hack into personal computers. According to the latest revelations from the WikiLeaks, earlier during the year, the country's second largest military contractor, Boeing, held talks with the hacker team in Milan, known for surveillance and different spy malware, on installing such malware on drones. The drone analysts have already even pictured possible scenarios. For instance, when an Al-Qaeda operative is hiding in a country far away from the United States, and hacking into his or her computer would be hard from the distance, or would require an old-style infiltration mission and plugging a USB card, a USB with a malware into his or her computer. So for this kind of mission, which requires close proximity, drones can potentially be used. Many drone analysts have already said that this would not be technically hard, and pretty much any high school student can design such kind of malware. The hacking team spokesperson staunchly denied that the group had any business contact with Boeing. The company itself, who, as we know, has been producing a number of drones, including the Scan Eagle and Phantom Eye drones, have also all but denied such kind of cooperation, at the same time saying that the company is working hard to understand the needs of the market, and well, this basically not completely ruled out the idea that it could be working on such an initiative. But drone analysts and aerospace experts have already said that the military would probably pounce on this idea to use this technology, since it's been doing a lot of missions requiring close proximity to the target, but they still want those missions to be low risk or completely risk free. It's also hard for now to estimate the potential economic benefits for Boeing if this contract really goes through, but the company, one of the leaders of the drone manufacturing market, would certainly gain from that in the industry, which is already worth at least $10 billion. Alexei Rashevsky, RT, reporting from outside Boeing office in New York City.
We all know that CEOs make far, far more money than the average working Joe and Jane, but just how much more is about to become crystal clear. On Wednesday, federal regulators voted to require companies to reveal the pay gap between CEOs and their employees. Joining us now live from New York with all the latest details on that is Miss Erin Ade. Erin, what can you tell us about this ruling?
Ameera, now we all know that income inequality, it's really intensified in recent years. And, you know, as the wages of top earners, they've far outgrown, at least faster outgrown, everyone else's wages. And after a long delay and plenty of resistance from corporations, the Securities and Exchange Commission voted 3-2 on Wednesday in a ruling that will order most public companies to disclose the ratio of pay between their chief executive's annual compensation and the median employee compensation. Excuse me. Now, the issue of executive pay has generated a lot of heated debate lately, especially with it being such a hot-button issue ahead of the 2016 presidential race. You know, in fact, the SEC, they received more than 280 comments on the issue since it floated this proposal 2 years ago, and the lobbying by business interest groups against the requirement, that was very intense, that's for sure. And, you know, the SEC, they acted under a mandate from the 2010 Dodd-Frank law that reshaped regulation after the financial crisis. Now, basically, outsized pay packages, often tied to a company's stock price, they were blamed for encouraging catastrophic risk-taking and short-term gains at the expense of long-term performance. We all know about that. And, you know, concerned executives, this is the one thing for them. They don't need to freak out just yet. This rule, or new rule rather, it won't go into effect until at least January 1st, 2017. So a little bit of time to get used to it.
Well, I'm sure representatives of corporations have had a thing or two to say about this. What have we heard from them?
Yeah, they certainly have. You know, corporate representatives, they were quick to attack this new rule, saying that it was misleading, costly to put into practice, and intended to shame companies into paying executives less. Now, the measure, like I mentioned before, it was tucked away in a 2010 Dodd-Frank law amid concerns about the growing disparity between compensation for chief executives and corporate workers. And Republican trade groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they fought back against this measure at every turn. But under the SEC's final rule, companies, they'll get some flexibility in how they find the median income of their employees. Now, for instance, what they can do, they can exclude 5% of their overseas workers, if they have any, of course, and use statistical sampling to arrive at that number. Also, you know, smaller public companies with less than 75 million in total shares held externally or less than 50 million in annual revenue, they're exempt from the disclosure, and so are emerging growth companies and investment companies. So there are some leeway here in terms of equating for how much your median worker makes.
Okay, and roughly speaking, I mean, do we know how much more money executives make than their average employee? I mean, is it as bad as we might think?
Yeah, it's not a bad question, Ameera. You know, 50 years ago, chief executives, they were paid roughly 20 times what their employees made, compared with the nearly 300 times as much paid out in 2013. And that's according to data from the Economic Policy Institute. And obviously, executive compensation, it varies from company to company, but the pay for, or pay discrepancy rather, between the top earners and the top CEOs of 2014 and their workers, you know, we have a quick chart for you. We can throw that up. A quick disclaimer, since we don't have the exact annual average for employees under the new SEC guidelines worked out, these are just rough estimates. I want to repeat that, but here goes. Now, the typical salary for Discovery Communications for the average worker there who's a producer, that ranges from $47,000 to $94,000, while Discovery Communications chief executive David M. Zaslav, I probably butchered poor Mr. Zaslav's name, he took home $156 million in salary, bonus, perks, stocks, and options in fiscal year 2013-2014. That was the highest earner by far for 2014. Next, we have Liberty Global. Their chief executive, Michael Fries, took home $111 million, while the average employee at the leading international cable company pocketed anywhere from $50,000 to $71,000. Investment advisory service Gamco Investors gave their CEO, Mario Gabelli, $88.5 million in 2014, and their average worker roughly $70K. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella was paid $84.3 million in 2014, while the national average salary for starting employees at Microsoft was about $91,000. And finally, rounding out the top 5 highest paid CEOs is GoPro founder and chief executive Nicholas Woodman. Woodman paid himself $84 million last year, while the average employee at the action camera manufacturer earned anywhere from $87,000 to just under $120,000 a year. So that gives you a rough estimate of the discrepancy there.
Wow.
It's big.
Quite a discrepancy, and that's why this ruling is such a huge deal, because there's going to be a little more transparency in the process. Well, Erin Ade, out of our New York studio, thanks so much for that reporting.
Thank you, Ameera.
Now for the big deal. I'm sitting here with our guest reporter this week, who's doing a fantastic job, I might add. And we are talking, I should tell your name, it's Manuel Rapalo. And we are talking about remittances. They are sent home by migrant workers living in foreign countries, and they are an invaluable lifeline for millions of families in the developing world. Globally, remittances from migrant workers amounted to an estimated $581 billion, and that was just last year. And with social trends showing a continued increase in immigration around the world, that number is only expected to grow in the coming years. So Manny, I want you to break down some of these numbers for us. As far as I understand, remittances from migrant workers, specifically here in the U.S. to Mexico, is on the up and up. What do you know about that?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. I know we all miss
Our
Ed.
pleasure.
We all miss Edward Harrison.
But we love having you.
I'm very happy to be on. We're talking about remittances. The big news coming out of the Bank of Mexico this week is a pretty big jump in remittances. We're talking about a 4% jump. We've got a chart right here that kind of highlights exactly that when it comes to remittances being sent from migrant workers. In the first half of 2015 alone, we're seeing $12.08 billion. That's just over the course of the first 6 months of 2015. This is no small chunk of change, and every year this number continues to grow. And I mean, we have to point out here, we're talking about a $23.64 billion in 2014. That's Mexico's second largest source of foreign exchange. So again, this is no small number. So I think that when we're talking about what's the significance of this, why is this a big deal? This, like you had mentioned before, is a significant. It's an invaluable lifeline for millions of families around the world, not only in Mexico and Latin America, the Caribbean, but it also helps foster economic growth. It helps foster businesses, and it helps give people in developing countries a chance at having a higher standard of living.
Right.
So in the larger scheme of things, it does have positive outcomes.
Indeed, we know. I mean, people leave their home countries and start over for those economic opportunities to send that money back home to their families. Well, remittances are, of course, sent through wire services and banks all around the world. So I'd imagine that this it has a huge impact on the banking systems globally. What can you tell us about that?
Right. Well, that's a two-parter question. The first, when we're talking about remittances, the way that they're being sent through banking institutions, through wire services, like you mentioned, it's still fairly expensive. For the average migrant worker anywhere in the world, I think is paying somewhere just upwards of 8% to send a remittance back to the country. Well, we've got countries with the G8, countries with the G20 that are targeting to bring that down to 5%. And what these countries are saying is that bringing that down to 5% cost, it could save migrant workers on average around the world around $14 billion a year. Now, and the thing is that this is great. We're not saying that it's great that people have to migrate in the first place. Of course, no one wants to have to leave their home country for whatever reasons to go to another country and have to work and send remittances in the first place. But the fact that this is happening and they're trying to save money for migrant workers, it does change the banking culture in the countries, and in a very specific way. And that's when we're talking in regard to savings. It encourages savings both in the host country, where the migrant worker is saving up money to send as remittances, and on the receiving end. It encourages saving on that end. So there are positive outcomes to this. and in the long run has proven to be beneficial for economic development, especially in the global south.
Indeed, and as far as I understand, it's a huge deal for Honduras, for example, which is the country you actually come from. I mean, how big of a stake is it for a country like Honduras? Right.
Now, we're talking about the impact that this has on countries in GDP. And again, I think it's a great thing. Again, we're not talking about immigration and the fact that people have to leave their home countries. Right. I'm an immigrant myself. I came here from Honduras. Honduras is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's the remittances from the United States alone coming to Honduras account for 20% of the country's GDP.
That's
a fifth of the country's GDP come from that alone. And so in the case of Honduras, obviously this is a huge benefit, but it goes beyond that. Look at countries like Cuba right now, for example, where normalized relations between Cuba and the United States. Cuba is a country where the average salary is $24 a month. When you're having remittances, a family member sending $200 every month, that's making a huge impact.
That's a game changer.
Absolutely, not only for the family, but for the economy as a whole. So
they're probably really excited right now about opening up that sector in and of itself. And perhaps lifting the economy up, which is, of course, what they really need right now. Manny, we ran out of time, but we've gotten through a lot, so I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight on that. We love hearing from you guys. Tweet at us at Erin Ade, at Manuel_Rapalo, and at Bianca Facchinei, and, of course, at yours truly, Ameera David. Remember, you can see all the segments featured in today's show on YouTube at youtube.com/BoomBustRT. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.